Thank you for joining our presentation today. My name is Ken Gioeli. I'm the University of Florida IFAS Natural Resources Extension Agent for St. Lucie County. And during the next few minutes, we'll be discussing some common invasive plants that are found on the Treasure Coast. Now we are going to share a list with you, and this list is an informal list. It is a list of invasive plants that the master gardeners during the recent training course brought to me. And they brought these plants to my attention as some of their more concerning plants. So it is by no way, shape, or form a list of the most invasive plants. It's just a list of common plants that you find here on the Treasure Coast. So the objectives today, the viewers will learn about the ecology and natural history of these invasive plants found on the Treasure Coast. It is also information about the IFAS assessment of invasive plants, and of course, what you can do as residents and visitors to the Treasure Coast region. Now, some of the resources that we have available, we have the IFAS books resources available to us. For those of you that might be viewing, you might be wanting to get a job doing this. Maybe you're going to be looking at working for a landscaping company, or maybe you're going to work for an association that has upland buffer preserves, and you'll be looking for and managing invasive plants on those properties. To do this, you can earn an natural areas pesticide license, and that is through the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Now, to study and get ready for that, you would take the core training exam, and you would study this training manual, applying pesticides correctly. You purchase it at the ifasbooks.ufl.edu website. I also recommend that you get the Natural Areas Weed Management Training book that we have here on the one side. And this training book will detail the information, the laws, rules, regulations, as well as some examples, and then management techniques that are needed for invasive plant management in Florida's natural areas. And that book that we see in the middle, that is a non-native plants book in Florida, written by Dr. Ken Langland and some of his colleagues. This book is my go-to book. When I go and look up invasive plants, this is a really great resource to have available, as well as the resources that we have online that, of course, many of them are free of charge to the citizens of the state of Florida. So with invasive plants in Florida, about 4,800 of these plants are found in Florida. And when I say 4,800 plant species in Florida, that's all the plant species that are found in Florida. And about 1,500 of them are exotic. In other words, they came from someplace outside of Florida. Not all of them are bad, not all of them are invasive. They just came from somewhere outside of the state of Florida. Now, there's an organization called the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. In short, we call that EPSI, the Florida EPSI organization. They produce a list. They have a list of Category 1 invasive plants, and then they have a list of Category 2 invasive plants. Now, the University of Florida, we don't really go by this list. We have another resource that I'm going to show you in just a minute. However, it's a very good place to start, and it seems to be one of the key resources that are available to land managers. So this Category 1 Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council list, there's about 80 species listed on that Category 1 list, and these are invasive exotic plants that are altering native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structures or ecological functions, or hybridizing with natives. These are going to be considered by FLEPSI the worst of the worst. And then we have this Category 2 list, which has about 85 species of invasive plants on it. And these are plants that are not quite as bad as the Category 1 plants, but they're still plants that are considered invasive by the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. So the story behind invasive plant invasion in Florida, basically about 60% of the invasive plants that we have were brought to Florida deliberately. And that's what the research shows. This includes earleaf acacia, Brazilian pepper tree. These were brought here for different purposes, sometimes for erosion control, sometimes for ornamental purposes, medicinal purposes, and sometimes they're brought here for food. And accidental introductions, they're about 12%. So alligator weed would be an example, as well as Caesar weed. Alligator weed is one of those plants that we see in our freshwater system, and very often it gets chopped up and moved around by boat propellers and movement of water. And the Caesar weed is one of those weedy plants that you find in natural areas. And if you've ever walked through a natural area in Florida, sometimes you get the little stickers on your socks and on your clothing. And more than likely, it's going to be from Caesar weed. That's one of the many different weeds that can put those little stickers on your clothing. So these have seeds or other propagules that contaminate, and they're accidental introductions. People move them around accidentally. Wildlife move them around accidentally. And then, of course, about 28% are unknown. The research is inconclusive. They don't know if they were introduced deliberately, accidentally. We just know that they're there. So some of the problems caused by invasive plants: they have a tendency to crowd out and outcompete native vegetation. They can reduce foraging and native habitat for fauna that are native wildlife, and especially in some pastoral lands, we have some particularly noxious invasive plants that can reduce foraging capacity for our cattle and horses. And then we also have invasive plants that can alter fire regimes. One classic example of that is old world climbing fern, Lygonium microphyllum. If it ever catches fire, it can become lighter than air and carry flaming embers from one side of the road to the other. Some of these invasive plants can alter water flow. If you've ever been in an area where we have Melaleuca growing, Melaleuca tends to grow very densely close together. They also have a tendency to produce a lot of leaf litter, and that leaf litter might actually change the sheet flow of the water on the surface of the land. So the water would have to go around the leaves instead of percolate into the soil as normal. So it can alter the water flow of the natural water systems in Florida. We've got some that threaten commercial, agricultural, and recreational activities. I had mentioned the one that can reduce foraging. Well, an example of that would be tropical soda apple. And that's a really noxious plant with little fruits on it that look like miniature watermelons. And that can be carried around by wildlife. And then, of course, there are some that harm people and animals. You see the person in the picture. More than likely, that person has a rash from a Brazilian pepper or some other plant that they are sensitive to. So why do plants, why are they considered invasive? How come they're invasive here and they might not be invasive in their native range? Well, there's a hypothesis called the enemy release hypothesis. So you see in this graphic that was produced by Dr. Carrie Mintier, she shared this with me. We've got the native range, and this is where the plant that we consider invasive in Florida, but when you go back to the native range where it came from, with the case of Brazilian pepper, it might be Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, the place of natural evolution, the evolutionary origin of the plant. And in that native range, you have some co-evolved competitors. You get herbivores, like in this picture, we've got a grasshopper, but there are many different types of herbivores. And these all put pressure on these plants that keep them from becoming a problem in the native range. So you can go to Brazil, and Brazilian pepper is not a problem there. But once you take it out of its native range and you introduce it to Florida in the invasive range, and you see the graphic here, I'm free to do what I want any old time. And there are no herbivores. There's no pressure being put on it. There's no need for defense. It frees up resources and allows the plant to basically populate and grow without check. And they could just take over an area before you know it. There is something called an invasion curve. You see that USDA Forest Service produced this really great graphic, and it very accurately describes this whole invasive process. What we try to do is prevent invasive species from coming in. And the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, they actually have employees that are stationed at ports of entry in Florida, and they will be scanning for some of these potential invasive insects and invasive plants, trying to make sure that they screen them and prevent them from getting into Florida in the first place. But these invasives, sometimes they're a little sneaky. They can get through that prevention process. And when that happens, there's going to be hopefully only a small number released in a localized population. And if we're quick enough, what we can do is get in there and eradicate that infestation very quickly. But it takes a lot of eyes and ears, a lot of people looking for invasive plants. And sometimes these invasive plants, people are not familiar with them. Now, keep in mind, the state of Florida has been pretty good at keeping them out in the first place. But then when you get these invasive plants getting a toehold in Florida, we might not necessarily be familiar with those plants. So when we don't recognize them, very often it's difficult to do that early detection, rapid response. So when that happens, we do try to get in there, do an eradication, try to stop the plant from becoming a pest and taking over Florida's natural areas. Once we move past that eradication phase, if we can no longer eradicate those plants, in other words, they have rapidly increased and distributed in abundance beyond that small localized population, eradication is unlikely, and at that point, we're dealing with containment. And with containment, you have to put the resources in to identify the pest problems and then get in there and actually manage the pest problems. And sometimes even that containment is difficult to do. When we get up to asset-based protection and long-term management, this occurs when invasive species become so widespread and so abundant that long-term management is aimed at population suppression and protecting the assets that are there. And in the case of maybe state and national and local preserves, there might be work crews that are hired to go in there and do asset protection, the asset being the natural area that has all the plants and animals that belong in Florida, and trying to keep that intact so that these invasive plants don't disrupt those communities. So, earlier I had mentioned that Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council list, the Category 1 and the Category 2. Well, the University of Florida has a wonderful tool, and we see the address up here. It's assessment.ifas.ufl.edu. And this IFAS assessment is an assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas. So if you go to this website, you can type in the genus and species name. Very often they can also cross-reference by common name, but keep in mind that common name, I could call one thing a common name and somebody else can call the same plant a totally different common name. You might not be able to look it up by common name. So very often that's a difficult thing to do. But if you can get it down to the species, the genus and species, you type that information into this IFAS assessment, and it will give you a list of whether or not it's prohibited in Florida by law. And sometimes there are federal laws, sometimes there are state laws. And then if it's a problem plant, it might be considered invasive. But on some of these listings, what's invasive in South Florida might not necessarily be invasive in North Florida. So this assessment does a really good job of trying to localize based on South Florida, Central Florida, and North Florida, whether or not the particular plant we're looking at is going to be a problem invasive plant. Now, this list of common invasive plants that I have here, there are 6 plants, and these 6 plants they're not considered to be the most invasive plants in the Treasure Coast area, but this is a list of some of the more well-known and the most notorious invasive plants that we have on the Treasure Coast. And we have air potato, old world climbing fern, melaleuca, Brazilian pepper, tropical soda apple, and then earleaf acacia. And this list is a list that the master gardeners, many of the master gardeners in the training class we offered recently listed these plants. So I figured I'd talk a little bit about them. And what I've done is I've linked each of these plants to the information that we have in that IFAS assessment. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of these plants. When I click on air potato, the air potato, the genus and species is Dioscorea bulbifera, and this is the identification page for air potato that we have on that list. Now, one thing that is missing on this, it would be really nice and helpful if we have pictures of the bulbils. And those bulbils basically are the aerial potatoes. They look anywhere from the size of a pea all the way up to the size of maybe a baseball, maybe even a softball. And each of the leaf axils, when it comes to the vine, you could be seeing one of those bulbils growing there. And eventually they become heavy enough that they fall off the vine and they can resprout. So potentially there could be hundreds of bulbils growing on a vine. The research says that this vine can grow up to 8 inches a day, and that's during the middle of the summertime when it's growing very rapidly in the state of Florida. A lot of sunshine, a lot of hot weather, a lot of moisture and humidity in the air, and they have a tendency of taking over natural areas when they get found, when they take a toehold in there. So what does the IFAS assessment say about this particular plant? It is prohibited in North, Central, and South Florida, and it's prohibited on the federal noxious weed list. It's also prohibited by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, prohibited aquatic plants, and it's also on the noxious weed list. It's considered to be a vine. Its origin is from Africa, Asia, Australia, and then you see some additional links and information for this particular vine. And that is Australia, that is the Dioscorea bulbifera, that is air potato. When we go back to our list, the next plant that we have on there is Old World climbing fern, that we're talking in this particular case about Lygodium microphyllum. And when I click on this link and it takes us to the IFAS assessment, once again, it gives us this really great ID. And if you look at this vine, just look at this vine, it just takes over. And if you look at the photo down in the bottom corner, you see that the leaf margins have these little structures. They're little finger-like structures on them. And this is a true fern. It reproduces by spore. And these little finger-like projections are the sori, where the spores are produced. And very often these vines can go up trees and tend to smother out the vegetation underneath them. Now, Old World climbing fern, Lygodium microphyllum, this is one of those plants that has some very insidious side effects in the environment. Florida, very often the plants that we have here are adapted to quick, rapid, hot fires. And we call that succession. A fire strike, a lightning strike might occur and the fire event occurs. Many of the plants and animals are adapted to rapidly moving fires. However, when you have Lygodium microphyllum, this Old World climbing fern, what tends to happen is the vine will carry the fire up higher in the tree, and it can actually cook the tree and kill it. So the mortality of the trees can be greatly impacted by Lygodium microphyllum. Another thing that can occur is this vine, when it starts to burn, can become lighter than air and actually carry those embers floating in the air. So, and one of the other things about having the vine reproduced by spores, many of these invasive plants, you see them growing in the perimeter, the disturbed portions of the natural areas where maybe people have done some construction or road work and they brought machinery in and there was contamination on the machinery and that brought seeds in. With Old World climbing fern, it can reproduce by spore and those spores can be carried in the wind. So you might have a completely perfectly intact natural area and smack dab in the middle of this area, you can have this Old World climbing fern just taking over. Now the IFAS assessment, it says that it's prohibited in North, Central, and South Florida. It is on the federal noxious weed list. It is on the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services aquatic plant list and the noxious weed list. It's considered to be a vine native to Africa, Asia, the Pacific area, and then of course we see some of these additional resource links down below. So going back to our wonderful link, we have Melaleuca and Melaleuca quinquenervia. Now there are a few different types of Melaleuca. Sometimes people get confused when we talk about Melaleuca because there are Melaleuca soaps and other products that are for sale out there. But what we're really talking about is the paperbark tree, Melaleuca quinquenervia. And that is one of the worst that we have in the state of Florida. And the IFAS assessment, once again, has a very nice description of Melaleuca quinquenervia. And you see where this particular tree gets the name paperbark. So you might be dealing with trees that have a diameter breast height of maybe about 6 inches. Some of these can be fairly large trunks. And if you start cutting through that, half of that trunk diameter breast height could be actual bark. So, squirting herbicides, applying herbicides on the outside of the bark probably is not going to impact the tree at all because it's very well protected. You notice that the flowers look very much like bottle brush flowers, except with bottle brush, they're red. With Melaleuca quinquenervia, we're dealing with white flowers. And then if you look at that bottom photo, when you have Melaleuca quinquenervia growing in a natural area, they have a tendency to outcompete the natives that are there, and they grow very tightly together. I've worked with this plant quite a bit. When a plant falls, very often in a hurricane or maybe a lightning strike, sometimes people might knock them down, cut them and leave them there. I've seen this particular tree root itself from the trunk that's fallen in the woods. So, it's one that very difficult to get rid of. The IFAS assessment, it gives us some common names. Melaleuca is a common name, paperbark tree, the punk tree. It is prohibited in North, Central, and South Florida. It's prohibited on the federal noxious weed list. Also, it's prohibited by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. It is a full tree. It's from Asia, Australia, and the Pacific area. And there are additional links in that IFAS assessment. Brazilian pepper tree, which is one of the most noxious trees that we have here in South Florida. And when you look at Brazilian pepper tree, it's really one of the worst that we have. So let me get that IFAS assessment up for it. Brazilian pepper tree, most people are familiar with this. Chinus terebintifolia. Its common name is a misconception. Brazilian pepper tree is one of the common names, but it's also called the Florida holly. It is not related to holly. It is more closely related to mangoes and to some of the more itchier of our plants, some of the more irritating plants that we have out there. And it can actually produce a rash on people. So Brazilian pepper tree, the best time to manage this particular plant is while it's flowering. And you see in the bottom corner, it has those white flowers. The flowering will generally occur in South and Central Florida, usually September, October, and maybe early November. Once it produces its flowers, it will then set its seeds. And then the seeds, of course, will be the thing that spreads that will be spreading the plant around. Wildlife will come in there. I know some birds, some robins, and I've seen raccoons and other wildlife eat the fermenting berries, and they will spread the berries in their droppings. And very often it's spread into natural areas where wildlife and birds and raccoons can spread it. And of course, machinery and vehicles can spread it. It is prohibited in Central, South, and North Florida. And that once again is on the federal noxious weed list and the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services list. It is considered to be a tree, and its place of origin is South America. And once again, there are some additional links on the IFAS assessment for Brazilian pepper tree. We also have tropical soda apple. Tropical soda apple, that is one of the most noxious plants that we have. And if you see these prickles on the plant, these prickles are available, it's on the top as well as the bottom of the leaves, and they're produced on the leaf veins. They're also on the stem of the shrub, and it's just one of the worst plants to interact with. You see these, if you look at that bottom picture, they almost look like miniature watermelons, and this is what wildlife, deer, some of the cattle will get into that. They will, I've had feral hogs, I've seen feral hogs eat these and spread them around. So the seeds get into the bodies through the fruit, and then they're passed around the fields and the natural areas in the guts, through the guts and feces, where the wildlife spreads them. This particular plant is prohibited in North, Central, and South Florida. And once again, that's on the federal noxious weed list and the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services list. And there's an abundance of resources available on the IFAS assessment on tropical soda apple. And then our last plant is the ear-leafed acacia. And ear-leafed acacia, it has these unusual looking reproductive structures, these spiral-shaped seed pods. The flowers are yellowish in coloration, and they tend to pop up in disturbed natural areas. We're seeing them more and more in these disturbed natural areas on the Treasure Coast. And my colleague, Dr. Carrie Mentier, is actually looking for natural predators, natural biocontrol agents to help us manage this invasive plant. This plant, they have a caution warning on this plant. The IFAS assessment says use with caution, manage to prevent escapes. So you might have some of these growing in a field. It will be a good idea to get in there and completely eradicate the earleaf acacia if you see them growing in an open field in a natural area that you might be managing. Because if you don't, chances are they're going to take over that natural area. The IFAS assessment is currently under review. It's in process, and they're looking for additional input on this species. And then they have differentiated this. North Florida, it's not considered to be a problem species, but in South Florida, it is considered to be invasive. There are no use for this. And then there's some additional information in the IFAS assessment dealing with this particular plant. So now that we have identified 6 of the most common invasive plant species that we have on the Treasure Coast, what can you do? Well, there are a few things you can do. You can learn about invasives through programs like this, and you can teach others about them. Share the information on that IFAS assessment with people that you know. If you live in a homeowners association, share this information with people that you interact with through the homeowners association. If you work with a landscaping company, well, become familiar with the plants that are on this list. Master gardeners, master naturalists, please work with these invasive plants to help us manage these plants in the natural areas, and also please take time to teach others about these plants as well. There is a system called I've Got One, and this is an app. If you have a cell phone, like most of us do, there's an app called I've Got One. It's free of charge. Go ahead and download that, install it on your phone, and then when you come into contact with an invasive plant, it can be an invasive plant that you might not be familiar with. You can even report invasive animals and insects that you want to notify people about. What you do is you upload pictures, you take the pictures with your phone, upload it to I've Got One, and then there are specialists on the other end of this that can do the identification and help you with identification of the potential invasive plant. This feeds into information in EdMaps. So if it is identified as an invasive plant, then there's going to be a little pin drop that's put in EdMaps, and it will help researchers map where the invasive species are commonly found. It's probably not necessary for people to report every Brazilian pepper tree or every Melaleuca tree that we have in Central and South Florida. We know they're here, but it's important for research purposes for you to identify and report some of the more uncommon invasive plants that we might not necessarily see very often. This way we can help researchers identify the rate of spread and maybe even if it's early on identification, doing early detection, rapid response. And then of course, manage invasive plants on your property. That's one of the most significant things that you can do. If you have Brazilian pepper tree on your property, go ahead and manage it effectively. The University of Florida has publications on management of many of these invasive plants. Go ahead and manage it using University of Florida research-based information. So generally the 4 most common ways of managing invasive plants, we've got mechanical management, and you see where they might be using heavy machinery, getting in there and downing and removing some of these invasive trees. Keep in mind that if you go into an area that has invasive plants, you need to completely sanitize and decontaminate your equipment, because you do not want to be spreading seeds of these plants in the wheels, in the tires, in the tracks, in the blades of your machinery. And the University of Florida does have information on how you can decontaminate your equipment when you move from one contaminated site to another. You can also use manual control like these gentlemen are doing in this picture. If you have some small seedlings, maybe you can pull them out with your hands. If they're small enough, go ahead and pull them out. You can also use cultural control, and it looks here like they're doing some fire management. You can also make sure that you're eliminating seed sources and things like that for cultural control. And then the last box that we have is biological control. And that is when we're matching plants, invasive plants, to the insects that come from the territory, the home territory of the invasive plant. And these insects have been put through host specificity testing. They've been thoroughly researched. They've been given the USDA stamp of approval, and they will help us manage the invasive plant in the state of Florida. So this is what we call biological control. If you're using herbicides, keep in mind that when using herbicides, it can be very effective. It's probably the most common way that people are managing invasive plants. The label is the law. So using these herbicides on the invasive plants, but make sure you read and follow those label directions. Don't apply in areas where the label does not allow you to apply it. If you want to apply it in wetland areas and these herbicides, you're not supposed to apply it to water, then the label says, the law says you cannot apply the herbicides there. You cannot apply more than the rate that's listed on the label, and you have to have the safety equipment that's listed on the label. So just be very careful when using these products. Make sure you're reading and following the label directions. So when you're using herbicides, you see what the top picture is. Somebody has cut an invasive plant. I don't know what particular tree that is, but they have cut that tree, and it's a fairly flat cut. And somebody is using a paintbrush to actually paint on the herbicide. Now, keep in mind that the xylem is the part of the tree that's inside the tree's trunk. It's not really where the phloem is transporting water and nutrients around the plant. You need to get into that phloem that's directly underneath the bark. And you see what they're doing with that paintbrush. They're getting that herbicide right in that phloem area, right inside the bark of that tree trunk. And that's where it's going to be most effectively used. It looks like they've also cut that tree trunk within 3 inches of the ground. Ideally, you want to be able to apply the herbicide within 5 minutes of cutting the plant down. And it looks like that's what they were doing. They were timing it, so they knew that they were getting in there fairly quickly. And you want that cut stump to be as flat and level as possible to help avoid runoff. Because if you have a stump that is at an angle, your herbicide is going to run off and potentially become a problem and contaminate and damage nearby plants. The gentleman with the backpack sprayer in the other corner, he is applying some sort of herbicide to Lygonium microphyllum. Well, it's one of the Lygoniums. I'm not sure if it's Old World climbing fern or the Japanese climbing fern, but that can cause a problem right there, because when he's doing that application, you could inadvertently be contaminating and impacting the plants that are underneath that vine. So if you use this method of application, keep in mind that the potential for drift is higher, and you also have the potential to impact the plants that are underneath that vine that are being sprayed on. So just be very mindful of that. The gentleman in the bottom corner is using a machete, and it looks like he's got a machete and he's trying to get through that Melaleuca trunk, and it looks like what he's trying to do is get to that phloem that's directly underneath that Melaleuca bark. So that's a really good method of managing managing Melaleuca quinquenervia. Cut that bark back, get to that phloem, and then do your herbicide application in right there. I would probably also recommend that you use a colorant, so this way they know which trees have been herbicided and which ones have not. And then the person in that last corner, it looks like they've got maybe Brazilian pepper tree or something like that, and they're using a fairly inexpensive handheld spray bottle, and they're applying probably some sort of triclopyr ester product with an oil. They're applying that around the trunk of the tree, and what will happen is that herbicide will go through the bark, get to that phloem, and be translocated throughout the plant and actually impact the roots and kill the tree off pretty effectively. Now, we also talked about not only the use of herbicides, but natural enemies. And a lot of work is going on in biology right now using natural enemies as biocontrol. One of the most classic examples of that was the air potato leaf beetle. And we were raising these insects as Lilioceras chenai. This insect is host specific to air potato. They will only eat air potato. They love to eat air potato. And we released a lot of these around the state, and they're doing a really good job of helping us get in front of that air potato problem. We also have in that middle picture, Gratiana bilibiana. That is the tropical soda apple beetle, and they're doing a really good job of chewing up the tropical soda apple plants. And they are just one more tool in our arsenal, one more weapon in our arsenal to help us try to manage these invasive plants. And then that last insect is Oxyaps vidiosa. And Oxyaps is an insect that we released, I believe it was the first insect that we released for Melaleuca control. And they do a really great job of chewing up those leaves on the Melaleuca trees. So my last issue to talk about here, I have a video. The City of Port St. Lucie Utilities Department, they produced this video, and they made it available on YouTube, and we'll just go in and take a look at this.
The University of Florida, the Indian River Research and Education Center, and the St. Lucie County Extension Office of the University of Florida worked together with the City of Port St. Lucie to deliver some insects for Brazilian pepper tree control.
Today we released biological control insects for Brazilian pepper tree, the Brazilian pepper tree thrips.
The insect is not a swarming insect, so it's a little tiny, almost microscopic, little black dot.
What we do is we go to the areas where these plants are from, so Brazilian pepper, it's Brazil, and we look for insects that are feeding on our target plant. We then bring those insects back into specialized labs called quarantine facilities in the United States to be able to test them.
The University of Florida had to prove that the insects were not going to be a problem. They couldn't be poisonous, toxic, they couldn't bite people, they had to be host specific to Brazilian pepper tree.
These insects are not invasive, they are completely safe, and will only feed on Brazilian pepper.
We're never going to be Brazilian pepper free, but it's going to be just another weapon in our arsenal against this invasive plant. So hopefully we'll use a little bit less herbicide when we manage these plants. It'll be a dollar cost savings, hopefully, to the City of Port St. Lucie and to the taxpayers of the county. And will also serve to protect water quality, such as the beautiful lake that we see behind us here at McCarty Ranch.
We've been doing biological control in Florida for over 100 years, and so we have a lot of experience and a lot of really good success stories behind us.
So that was my colleague, Dr. Carrie Montier, brilliant, one of our young, brilliant scientists at the University of Florida. And she is working every day to help Floridians manage invasive plants and using natural enemies like that Brazilian pepper tree thrips and helping people incorporate the use of these biocontrol agents in invasive plant integrated pest management plans. So we have a lot of information available on invasive plants, on how to manage invasive plants, and of course, biological control of invasive plants. And thank you for joining us today. And I appreciate your time. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact us at the Extension Office.